Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's session. My name is MJ, and I am the Events and Marketing Coordinator at Recreation Connections Manitoba. Before I go into the session and the instructions for today, I'd like to acknowledge that Recreation Connections Manitoba is located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homelands of the Métis Nation. Our office sits in the Treaty 1 territory and the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe people. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledge the harms, mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Once again, welcome to today's webinar on 6 things you need to know about benchmarking for recreation. We will be having a short session with Troy Sky, who is a 23-year, who has 23 years experience in parks municipal government, and he has a background in parks operation and capital planning, as well as extensive knowledge in strategic asset management planning. He is also well versed in asset management implementation and has established his own consultancy firm, which specializes in asset management training. He's currently working with the Canadian Parks Benchmarking Program. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Troy Sky.
Thank you, MJ. That's always listen to that bio and kind of write down how can I improve that for next time. But thank you, MJ, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I understand there's quite a few from Manitoba and some from Regina and out east. So great, thanks for spending your lunch or your breakfast or wherever you are, brunch, with me and talking about asset management. It's a little strange doing this in my basement. I would much rather be in person, speaking to you in person. In fact, I was born and raised in a small town in Manitoba, so trying to get back there as often as I can is always a goal. But hey, when a pandemic strikes, you have to roll with the punches and go with it. I like a lot of people, Zoom meetings, kind of go-to meetings. So this is good. I'm glad we live in 2020 and not 10 years ago when this wouldn't be possible. So thanks everyone for joining. So I'll get into the presentation in just a second, but I just want to give you a background on this actual presentation and kind of how I deliver it. Usually pretty light and hopefully pretty informative. So whenever I give these kind of presentations, I always run it by my wife first because she is, quite frankly, a lot smarter than I am. And she took a look at this one, and the first thing she asked is, who's your audience? It was kind of a lot of recreation professions, because usually I give a lot of presentations to engineering type people and finance people, and they like a lot of technical stuff and graphy stuff. And this original title was the symbiotic relationship between parks asset management and benchmarking. And my wife immediately said, no, you cannot call it that. So came up with a different one, and here we go. So, but that conversation kind of got me thinking, I should actually do a little more research online on how to give a proper webinar, how to present and everything like that. So I do what a lot of people do and go into TED Talks to find just that, which FYI never do before you're going to give a virtual presentation, because you'll quickly realize that you've done everything wrong and then start panicking, but just like I did, but that's okay. We'll go with it, and it's pretty lighthearted. So I watched these TED Talks and I found one that I like. And they said the first thing is never have a title that's a technical title. So I ditched that other one, like I said, and we came up with this one, but I'll retract a little bit. So 6 things you need to know about benchmarking for recreation. And I mean for the recreation industry. I'm not suggesting you do benchmarking on your nights and evenings for recreational purposes. That might be a little sad, but for the recreation industry. And the other thing this TED Talk told me is whenever you have possibility of a technical presentation, never start the presentation after your title page with a technical graph. So here's my first slide, and I guess 1 out of 2 isn't bad. So, but there's 2 things I like about this slide. And number 1 is this graph has nothing to do with this presentation. This is what happens when you Google .graph and this shows up. The other thing I like about this graph is this happy little outlier here has absolutely nothing to do with it. It was just me trying to play with animation to figure out how I can get a smiley face to get bigger with animation. I don't even want to tell you how long it took me to do that, but there it is. So that's not the end of the graphs, but that's a fun little one that I like to start off with. So 6 little things that I've learned about benchmarking in terms of recreation. So I've been doing this for a while, and I have used this information to help have a conversation and tell the story of where the organization, in that organization that I work for, where we sit in the world of recreation. And I'll go into a lot more detail of all 6 of these bullet points. And it can be sort of academic when you look at this kind of, oh yeah, well, of course, these are kind of important things hopefully you're going to be getting out of benchmark. But it's funny, when you're the person that's expected to deliver this information, you have a number of aha moments and you have a number of oh no moments. And I'll give you an example. The first benchmarking initiative that I took part in talked about a number of measures, and one of the ones that for my organization at the time that stood out is the number of the provision of playgrounds per 1,000 children between 2 and 12 years old. And that was kind of an aha moment for me and for the organization that I work for. And that'd be a great performance measure to use for a level of service for provision of playgrounds. And that's a great measure we should know, and that's a great measure we should communicate how much we provide and if that's sustainable or not. And then I had to actually get the information. So how many playgrounds did we have? And that was kind of a, oh no, we don't actually know that. And the second one is how many kids between 2 and 12 are there? And that was another oh no, is kind of how do we get that? Which a helpful hint is the federal census has that information for most municipalities, but about 5 years ago, they stopped doing the long census every year. So they have 2 times for every 5 years, they kind of give that very detailed demographic information. And it turns out that the organization I work for, Calgary, did have the number of playgrounds. It just wasn't readily available at the time. So I got the information, got the measure, and I found, but I found that the process of getting that information was actually just as powerful as the actual numbers themselves. So out of that one little kind of oh no / aha moment, we were actually able to create an operational cost comparison for the different criteria for that certain measure. We were actually able to get financial performance measure. How much does it cost to maintain that provision? And we determined the actual provisional level of service, what's sustainable for us, and use that level of service to kind of lobby for resources, or at the very least explain the risk to levels of service if there's a lack of funding, both in operational and in capital renewal. We also use this experience to plan a strategic goal and direction, and base that that direction based on our level of service. So we can kind of say, here's where we want to go, here's where we are right now, and here's the resources that we need to get there. So a simple little benchmarking question created a set of numbers. Yes, a set of numbers, so X amount of playgrounds for every 1,000 kids. But the process of that benchmark and getting that information is definitely just as important as the actual number. And it basically created a defendable management program. And that's kind of the basis of what I want to talk about here today, and kind of some of my personal and situations and what has happened to me and how it can hopefully help you guys. So how did I get started? This is kind of a roundabout way for me how I got started. So I started this journey when I worked for the city of Calgary, and it's kind of a funny, weird way how I fell into this, because I'm not an engineer at all. I'm not a finance person at all. I'm actually a horticulturalist by trade, and I've worked in the parks and recreation industry for a while. And about 12 years ago, the Calgary was implementing a asset management software, and they're looking for internal people to kind of train the trainers for the entire department. And this seemed kind of interesting challenge. So I volunteered. And in the middle of this secondment, I was training a group of about 20 people, and my boss at the time came in at the break and told me that, Parks needs to write an asset management plan, and was wondering if I wanted to do it. And he assured me this is going to be super easy. There'd be help, there'd be consultant help, and there'd be a new shiny system that, I was training, so I knew it well. And it's going to be simple, no problem. So the first thing I did when I got home that day was, of course, Google what is asset management. Never a great way to start. And I got a lot of different definitions. So, however, none of them talked about software, and most definitely none of them talked about that it was easy. So with the help of the consultant, and a few years later, I produced the first asset management plan, and with an emphasis on level of service. And it was a good first plan, and like many first asset management plans, the most important section was the improvement section, because we had a lot of improvement to do. We had a lot of good self-discovery moments of kind of, we're doing good, but man, can we improve? But despite the software system, we had no reference of what was an appropriate level of service. Was our provision numbers adequate? Was it too much? Was it not enough? Were there capital and operational spends in line with industry standards? Was there an industry standard? We kind of didn't know. So these questions came up, and of course, the simple response at the time was, what are other organizations doing? How are they sitting compared to us? Now, we had informally benchmarked with Edmonton in the past because they were very close to us, very close to size and location, and we had a good relationship with them. But we wanted to expand out, so we wanted to look around for parks and recreational specific benchmarking programs, and we found that one that we liked, and we joined it, and the organization has been a member since then. And one of the things there's two spectrums that I find when people start getting into benchmarking, and that is how they start. On one end of the spectrum, there's organizations that want to improve their best practices. They want to know where they are in the world. On the other end of the spectrum, when I talk to people and I ask, how did you get into this? It was, we were told to. So, and there's all the kind of gray area in between. And it sounds like from my little story there, it was kind of, we wanted to learn how to improve. But quite frankly, on my perspective, I was told you're going to benchmark. But as we were getting the information and as we were beginning to learn from it, we kind of evolved from that and went from, I'm being told to do this to produce a report, to, wait a minute, there's a lot of good measures here, and there's a lot of stuff that it's hard for us to get, but we should get. So it was kind of that evolution of, we're being told to do this, to there's a lot of good information here, and if we incorporate this into our best practices, we can actually become a better organization. So kind of rolling into what we don't know and trying to improve on that. Long way of me saying I got into the benchmarking game and I really like it. And it's a good way to start and figuring out where you are in the world. So this little slide, and wouldn't it be nice to have a magical benchmarking button that will magically tell you the answers? And I quickly found out, and I'm afraid to say this, that there is no such button. Anybody who is telling you that you press this and you'll get all the information, I would second guess them, because there is no magic button. There is, and a few things that I found out about benchmarking as I went along is, again, I talked about this before, I found that the process of benchmarking is equally as important than the final outcome of benchmarking. So figuring how you got it and developing processes so it can be repeated again to get that final outcome is just as important, because it really helps your organization to become a more mature and being able to understand how the organization actually works and the numbers and the information behind the scenes. And it allows you to communicate a lot better in terms of what you have and how it's related to costs. And benchmarking exposes areas of improvement, even if you didn't know it was there. So which every organization does have. And it's up to you to improve on it, or some places actually hide it. And the organizations that I have talked to and accept their weaknesses and try to improve it get the most out of benchmarking. It's not about the one with the most wins. It's the one who accepts what they have and is able to tell that story, if it's sustainable or not. And if they want to improve, they can now tell how that improvement might look in terms of more funds, more resources. Organizations who kind of hide their weakness often don't have a lot of results from benchmarking, I find. They're looking for that magic button, I found. There's always people that have those aha moments and kind of work from there. But if we stay in that mindset of we're not going to worry about our weaknesses. And I was at a conference, this was about 8 years ago, and an asset management conference. And I was talking to one person, and they were saying, we were talking about benchmarking and the different available benchmarking platforms that are out there. And there's a number of them that are out there. And we were talking about it, and this one person was kind of gauging how they liked the benchmarking platform based on if they could actually answer the questions or not, and basically if they were hard or not. And I was kind of, ooh, well, do you think there's good questions about that? Is there good measurements? He goes, yeah, they are, but we can't answer them. So I would say, if any advice from this is, don't worry if you can't answer it, but if they're really good questions, start figuring out processes so you can readily answer those questions. So, and the other thing that I found out is, when it comes to benchmarking, there are no other organizations that are exactly the same out there, but there are a number of organizations that have very similar areas as you. So if we were looking for that exact doppelganger of our organization, of our recreational facilities, anything like that, there's not one that's ever exactly the same. But if you get into that group, if you get in a community of practice in benchmarking, there's a lot of organizations that are very similar. And I found that out the easy way, I guess you might say, with when we were benchmarking with various organizations across Canada. And then looking at information, we actually found that Helsinki was in Scandinavia was actually very similar to Calgary in terms of its natural area management plans. So we actually formed a very good benchmarking kind of group with that organization in terms of natural areas. So there's nothing exactly the same, but there's a lot of very similar areas that we can gleam onto. And finally, I found that benchmarking is not a project. It should be looked at as a management tool, something to incorporate into your whole management processes. If it's just looked at as a project, you're kind of going back to that magical button again, I found. So one of the 6 things that I need to know about benchmarking, everyone needs to know, is that comparing costs and comparing it with different criteria measures or a criteria measure. The great thing I found about benchmarking is it forces you to not just look at numbers without comparison. I've spoken with organizations who have tried to benchmark with organizations and compare operational capital funding or provisional numbers without any other criteria. And that can be kind of dangerous, because it gives you the optic that the one at the top, the one with the most, wins. And that can be a very dangerous way to look at benchmarking, because it's not the one with the most that wins. It's about providing the best service with the funds available. So comparing costs with different criteria gives a bit more detail or a different perspective on how your funds can be reviewed or allocated, and how it can be compared by site, by landmass, by groups, by users using our facilities, or by population, or by hours, or the amount of customers. You get the point here. But I found that using these different perspectives with respect to cost and provision really help to shine a light on how levels of service can be connected and affected by less or more funding. And that's a very powerful bit of information that we can use for our organization. One of the other ones is the financial performance review. And a great way to do this is to look at benchmarking, look at it as benchmarking against other people, other organizations, other community recreation centers, but also benchmarking yourself and reviewing your own financial performance and your own provisional performance for that matter. Looking back on those trends on your own organization really helps you to see if you're trending in the right track. Now in New Zealand, organizations, because I work with a lot of people from New Zealand and Australia, but in New Zealand, they often set a budget percentage target for parks and recreation agencies. So they often say 10%. It differs from organization to organization, but let's say 10% of the overall organization budget should be allocated to recreation agencies. And they benchmark themselves using that measure. One, to say that they're sustainable, and two, that if budget cuts are lower than 10%, administration can say to council, you're not supporting the business unit and there will be additional risks and consequences. And that's actually usually in their overall council objectives, is that percentage for each business unit, and including recreation. So benchmarking yourself in financial performance reviews. And if we look at this example here, you can see that on the screen, in 2015 for this organization, operational costs for their urban forest almost doubled. Now, why is that? Oh yeah, we had a major snowstorm in 2014 and most of our urban forest was damaged, and now we need to regrow, repair, prune most of the forest. Now that's good information to have in terms of numbers, so you can see the spikes and stuff like that and be able to, talk about it. But if we dig a little deeper, we can see how we can use that information for future and for other organizations as well, because, well, if we had another disaster similar, and this data tells us what we needed to double our operation from the last snowstorm, that can be affected to the entire tree population. Now, I know every situation is different, but using this information is kind of key to benchmarking, and I think it helps us to guide our decisions, to make sure we're on the right track, and learn from past and from other organizations to help guide our decisions in the future. Now, I can't go without a presentation without General Akbar kind of showing it here. And now I want to talk to you about a little bit, some traps of benchmarking that I've fallen into, and I've seen a lot of other organizations, because there are some traps. And especially when starting up, and especially when it comes to finance and provision. And I talked a little about it before. So typically when you think of benchmarking, most people think of something like this. Some sort of data like provision numbers and finance with a select group of organizations, and that's really good. It shows where we are in the group, but it can also be a bit misleading if you don't put it into context. Organizations, especially management, might look at this graph and interpret that organization at the top is the best, and organization at the bottom is quite possibly not the best or the worst. And there you have everyone in the middle. So again, I go back to why we're actually doing this. Why have the numbers turned out the way they did? And how have these organizations incorporated best practices and management practices, processes? It could be that the organization with the most infrastructure has no idea if they're sustainable or not, and the other organizations who might be on the lower end of the scale might be quite happy where they are because they have a performance measures, they have sustainability ratios, they have management plans, they actually are happy where they are and they can communicate that. I guess that's in a long-winded way of me saying, when an organization undertakes some sort of benchmarking program, it's very important to benchmark best practices and management practices as well. Do they have levels of service that are documented, and are they attainable? So they produce a set numbers and everything, but now can we benchmark their best practices, see if they are sustainable? And that's a little different to look at benchmarking, because typically we kind of look at provision and finance, usually. And that's very important. It's kind of the cornerstone of it, but also digging a little deeper to see how best management practices are also benchmarked. That's also a very important thing. So try and stay out of that benchmarking trap and trying to look at it as in all different perspectives. So another thing I really like to talk about, which is a little bit sad, is levels of service. And I've talked about it a little bit, and determining those levels of service. And benchmarking can really help us determining that if we're sustainable or not. And when I like to talk about levels of service, I put it into these four groups. So first of all, corporate. These are those high-level corporate initiatives or council priorities. They're usually very high in the sky statements, not a lot of detail. Things like caring, safe city, which is a good statement, but there's not a lot of information behind that. The next is customer level of service. These are usually some sort of satisfaction survey. Again, they can be somewhat vague, but there are some really good ones out there that give good information. And being a recreation guy, whenever I see recreation services in these large surveys, I like to ask, what questions are they asking regarding the recreation organization or business unit? And it's usually kind of the same type of questions as, do you enjoy the recreation that's provided? And most people do. And do you enjoy the recreation services? And usually we get a good response, but it can be somewhat vague again. Next, number 3 is the asset and asset level of service. So this is where we come in. So this is the asset information, and using that information to provide performance measures that tie back to the customer level of service. These are the things how we are managing the assets, and this how it helps, it gives the service to the customer, and then ultimately ties into that corporate high level goal that we're looking for. Lastly is operation performance indicators, or key performance indicators, whatever you want to call them. And these are the things that we do every day to help assets perform and require that promote that asset level service, which again goes to the customer, goes to the corporate directive. So they're all kind of tied together. And now I found that most organizations do these fairly well, corporate and operational performance measures. They usually have some sort of high level goals, and they usually have some sort of operational performance indicators, even if they're maybe not written down, but they usually have something going on for what they do every day. I found that organizations do these ones, customer, okay, again, they can be a little bit vague, and the asset levels of service, I find that a lot of people have problems kind of getting this. Now, there's been a lot of work done over the last few years of getting the information on our assets, where they are, what condition they are in, costs and everything. But I find there's still a big gap of using that information to actually help our business and make better business decisions. And it's tough because you ask that question, here's where we are, but you might ask, what's everybody else doing? And that's how benchmarking can really help with these levels of service, all 4 sections of it, because it's that whole community of practice and community that's actually helping us. We don't have to do this alone. We don't have to be an island onto ourselves. So that's my preamble of level of service, something I'm sadly somewhat passionate about, because I think this is the cornerstone for us. I think this is where we can really communicate how what we do helps our customers and helps those high level goals. And now we have to get down into reality. Everybody wants this. Everyone, kind of wants a somewhat ostentatious pool in Versailles someplace, and nobody wants an empty pool with nothing in it and somewhat broken. So using benchmarking information and benchmarking best practices, those management tools, and benchmarking with other organizations, I've used this to create a sustainable level of service. No, we're not going to have perfection, but I also don't think we can have failure as well. And I use this direction for council to set their priorities. And I've used customer expectations and the current state of assets, both condition and provision and activities that we do to maintain those assets. Then I kind of tied it to budget, both operational and capital, to set out the cost of what that cost will look like. And we come up with this. Pie in the sky perfection isn't usually possible, and we don't want failure, but now we can sit where we are in between there and kind of demonstrate how we can get costs. And that leads into lobbying for resources. So basically, level of service plus available funding, plus with the help of benchmarking, helps develop that sustainable level of service. Now, if you tie your level of service to funding and it'll help with the benchmarking information. You can argue that sustainable services and what it costs to actually be there. And you can also argue what a lack of funding looks like to those levels of service. And the good news is you can provide this because if you're benchmarking, you have a whole group of people that also kind of use the same system, use that kind of tie together to get that information. And at this point, it's not hearsay. It's not just us complaining that we don't have enough money. It's actually a defendable, data-driven information on what sustainable service looks like. And I always like to use the quote from W. Edwards Deming, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And that's kind of a roundabout way of saying that this is where we are. Everybody must bring data to actually explain where we are in the world. Because lobbying for resources, what we do is very important, I think, in the recreation field. Economic benefits, there's environmental benefits, there's, of course, health benefits, but without sustainable assets, some of those benefits can come to a grinding halt. And it's it can be hard to communicate those, but with having a community of practice, having that benchmarking community of kind of, this is how we are looking at it as a community, I find it's very helpful to keep those gears moving and allow us to lobby for resources and use it as a communication tool. I'll stop that before we start getting all hypnotized and whatnot. So another really good thing to do about, another really good key factor about benchmarking, number 5, if you will, is identifying trends. So the first stage, I find that identifying trends is knowing what we have. I used to say this used to be the easy part, so figuring out what we had in our recreational facilities and our parks and everything like that. Now but it's not that easy. It's actually a lot of work. Now I say it's kind of the more straightforward part. There's a bunch of assets that we have out there. We need to know what they are, and we need to know what the condition is. We need to know information on them. And this is where I find that sometimes organizations can start to lose their way on remembering why the assets actually exist in the first place, because gathering data can be so all-encompassing and most of your focus is on the task. It's easy to put the blinders on and fall into that trap of asset data gathering, and losing sight of why it's actually there. And it's there to provide a service. And you start to record at the end there, that swing that's broken. And that's why I put it in there. You start to look at it, oh, the swing has failed, or that asset has failed. And you fall into that trap of, you stop to consider why it failed, and you need to identify those trends. And again, being part of that benchmarking community helps you focus on looking at trends in a community of practice. So it's important to keep perspective on the services that we provide. And if there is a service interruption, asking as an organization some fundamental questions. Why did it fail? Is this a trend? Will this affect our levels of service? Will risk increase? Whenever there is an asset failure, I like to do the do-to process, or root cause analysis. So ask why the swing broke. Oh, it's due to age. Okay. So why is the swing past its useful life? Well, we can't replace it in a timely factor. Why can't we replace it? Because we don't have a life cycle capital plan. Why don't we have any funds? Oh, we actually don't have a renewal program for playgrounds. So it's due to, you kind of get down to the actual root of the problem. What I'm getting at is digging a little bit further, instead of just saying the problem is the swing broke, go a bit further and understand that there's a deeper cause to the problem, and understanding that the asset breaking isn't actually the problem. That's just the outcome. The problem is we have actually no capital renewal program, and we can't even begin to ask the question to council for funding because we don't have a plan yet. So kind of doing that root cause analysis, identifying trends, but more importantly, digging a little deeper to figure out why those trends are existing and kind of coming up with the ultimate solution. I think Albert Einstein said if he had 20 minutes to solve a problem, he would spend 19 minutes figuring out what the problem is and 1 minute to solve it. This is kind of what I'm getting at, figuring out what the actual problem is and then figuring out the trend and the problem, how to actually, the solution to actually fix it. And that sounds daunting, that sounds hard, and it is, but that's where benchmarking comes in, because you can have that community of practice helping you figuring out those trends, because a lot of people have done this, gone through the same thing before. And I think of it as benchmarking as, I know this analogy has been kind of done to death, but if you just use benchmarking information like your typical information like provision and finance, you only see part of the story. If you take the time to look a little closer and dig a little deeper, and you can answer that question of that why question, is what's behind the numbers, and look at best practice management practices, and you can start to see a little bit bigger picture and what it looks like. And that's part of that. Going into number 6, the 6th part of one of the key things for benchmarking is strategic goals. So provision and finance, and that's what it's important to benchmark information like provision and finance. It's kind of the cornerstone. That's what most people think of. It is important, but remember there can be a trap there if you just look at it at face value of provision and finance, and we start to get that attitude of, again, the one with the most money or the most assets wins. So we should also be benchmarking against management best practices, such as operational excellence, asset management practices, strategic planning, environmental sustainability, community engagement, just as some examples. So kind of looking a little deeper in how organizations are actually managing their assets will really helps in the overall benchmarking process. And it sounds like a lot, and it can be, but Rome wasn't built in a day, and we have to start somewhere. So it's actually a very good process to look at the management practices as well as the actual numbers. And tying those strategic goals. So this is a bit of a scary looking graph and whatnot. So, but using the information aligned our strategic goals and direction and support business decisions. And it's a candid way to connect reality with decision making. So whenever I find that there's very much a tie-in between asset management and benchmarking, because a lot of these bubbles that you see right here are the things that we should be asking in benchmarking. And it's kind of laying that foundation of what we have, what it's worth, the condition, and then start getting into the basics. Let's talk about our levels of service and what we can provide and how it affects risk. And then we start going to how is it tied to our capital and finance investment, and what's the best strategy, what we can do with our available funding. So kind of going from that foundational stuff, going into direction and investment and strategy, and kind of working our way to actually complete that circle, or at least communicating on how we can do that. And that's a huge paradigm shift for a lot of organizations. And it's a lot of work, and it's tough, and I don't want to put anybody off, but again, you actually don't have to do this alone. A lot of other organizations have done this before, but with the help of bringing it together and using benchmarking best practices that help you, guide you in developing this, is actually a really great way of getting, you don't have to do this alone. There is a large community out there that are willing to work with you and willing to help solve these problems. I do a lot of work with recreation and with parks, and believe it or not, with the medical profession. And although medical profession, parks and recreation can seem very different from the outside, I find that a lot of the culture and their willingness to share information and willingness to help are extremely connected. And that's the great thing about benchmarking and being part of that community of practice. It's really, really helpful to kind of help guide you on next steps, where to go, how to do it, and how other people have done it before, and some of the traps that they've fallen in before. So I think we touched on each of these: benchmarking benefits, 6 little things that I've learned from it in my experience. And I find that the cost of benchmarking, now that cost being either actually monetary or the time to benchmark, is an extremely wise investment. Not only in numbers, not only in the numbers, getting the numbers. Again, those processes of benchmarking and finding that information and discovering your organization's strengths and finding the weakness is just an important process as well. And I find it greatly outweighs the cost because you become a part of that community of practice. And I know a number of organizations that have integrated benchmarking practices into their organizations, and they are definitely at the top of the game, I think, in fair enough to say, in industry, because again, I said this a number of times before, you don't have to be an island unto yourself. There's a larger group out there that are willing to help, willing to assist everyone for the industry to get better. So what's stopping you? I find that a lot of organizations, they had come down in 3 kind of, I guess, excuses, you might say, why they don't want to do this, why benchmarking isn't for them. And number 1 is no evidence-based decision-making for their organization right now. So they're completely reactive, doing completely reactive work. And that may be very true, but one of the benchmarking benefits is you can prove that. Not just saying that it's not just saying it, and as the information improves through benchmarking and through that, going through those processes, you can see that switch between reactive work and planned work. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's fast, but I am saying you don't have to be alone. And there's a larger group out there that is willing to help. The next one is, I find that a lot of people say we have no data. No data, so I can't participate. But what we've talked about in using benchmarking and information to prove your processes and practices, data and management practices, it's a major benefit to benchmarking. And if you're going to start collecting data, which pretty much a lot of us now in the 21st century have to do with TCA and just basic asset management practices and business practice, if you have to start collecting your data, why not have that community of practice that's willing to help and guide and share their experiences to help? There's a lot of organizations that have walked this path, and why not learn from them? And then the final one, and this is more of a why don't organizations continue with benchmarking, is I find that they focused on the tool of benchmarking as opposed to the processes needed to get their information. They're kind of looking for that magic button, that that slide that I had at the beginning of this presentation. And again, there is no magic button, so don't expect one. But that process of getting the information is extremely valuable. That's what I found. And I've said this a few times already, but that community practice. I know I talked about 6 things to know about benchmarking. I'm adding in a little added 7. Having that community of practice. Having an organization that you can be a part of, see how industry are dealing with issues and how they're dealing with new demand factors can be a great help. And there's a great benefit to benchmarking, again, to be a part of that community. There's no need to be an island unto yourself. There's an entire industry that's willing to share and collaborate with you. And one of the things out there, there's a number of benchmarking initiatives out there. One of the ones that I've used, and they all have their different flavor, one that I've used is Yardstick. And I use it in the public sector, and now I do some work for them. And it is a parks and recreational facility benchmark initiative. It has, I think, about 24 members in Canada and over 100 worldwide, with organizations in Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavia, and of course Canada. And it follows those principles that I've spoke of before: benchmarking, provision, and finance information, but also industry best practice and management best practice. And so that's the one that I originally used with City of Calgary, which they are still using today, I believe. And that's what, almost 45 minutes. Perfect. That's, if there's any questions, MJ, I'm not sure if there's anybody out there that has some questions, but can take them now if there are any.
Thank you very much, Troy. I don't see any questions in the chat. If anyone has any questions, they can ask now, or they can, if they prefer, they can either email myself or Troy. So Troy's email is showing up on the screen right now, and my email is reconnections@sportmanitoba.com, and it's also available on our website.
Great. Quiet group, but that's all right.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Troy, for coming. We will be sharing the recording of the webinar today, and it should be available tomorrow or Friday afternoon at the latest. And our next webinar is going to be in July, and you would also receive information on that, and it would be on risk management in the face of COVID-19. Thank you to everyone for coming. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.